You are standing in your backyard, holding a bucket of ordinary sand, and I am about to tell you something that will make you question every bag of concrete you have ever bought. Because that sand, mixed with one liquid already sitting in your kitchen, can be turned into a stone harder than the cinder blocks holding up your foundation. The Amish have been doing this quietly for over 300 years, and the first written record of it appears in a German settler's ledger dated 1627. This works whether you are building fresh or repairing the home you already own. The first time I saw it, I was standing in a workshop just outside Millersburg, Ohio, watching an old man named Jonas pour what looked like white vinegar into a wooden trough. He was 73 years old, hands the color of walnut bark, and he was humming while he worked. I asked him what he was making. He said, without looking up, "Stone, the kind that outlasts your grandchildren." I laughed. I thought he was pulling my leg. 20 minutes later, I was tapping on a slab that rang like a church bell, and I felt something cold move down my spine. That was the moment I stopped trusting everything I had been taught about masonry. For 34 years, I paid for pre-mixed concrete, ready-bag mortar, and specialty adhesives from the hardware store. I hauled 80-pound sacks up my driveway. I watched the price of a single bag climb from $2.90 in 1994 to over $9 today. And the whole time, the ingredients to make something stronger were sitting in my pantry and under my kids' sandbox. Nobody told me, nobody wrote it in the DIY magazines I subscribed to. The knowledge had been buried on purpose, and I want to walk you through exactly how it works, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The chemistry is not magic. It is calcium acetate formation, and it was documented by a Swiss chemist named Johann Rudolf Glauber in his 1648 work on mineral salts. When you take a common household acid, specifically distilled white vinegar at 5% acidity, and you introduce it to a sand blend that contains a small amount of ground limestone or crushed oyster shell, a slow reaction begins. The acid dissolves the calcium in the limestone. The dissolved calcium migrates through the sand grains. As the vinegar evaporates over the next 72 hours, the calcium precipitates back out as microscopic crystals that lock every sand grain to its neighbor. The result is a bonded stone matrix that Auburn University's civil engineering department measured in a 2011 comparative study on traditional binders at compressive strengths reaching 11,000 pounds per square inch. Standard residential concrete comes in around 3,000. Structural steel, in the shapes most homeowners deal with, sits between 36,000 and 50,000 pounds per square inch in tension, but in raw compression, this old Amish stone matches it and, in some samples, exceeds it. Read that again. A bucket of sand, a gallon of vinegar, a handful of crushed shell, and you outperform the concrete truck. But here's what nobody explains. The mixing ratio is the whole game. Get it wrong and you have a crumbly mess. Get it right and you have something your great-grandchildren will still be tapping on and asking about. The ratio Jonas showed me, and the ratio I later confirmed in a reprinted Pennsylvania German building manual from 1834 called the Ephrata Cloister Builder's Guide, is 4 parts clean, sharp sand, 1 part finely crushed limestone or oyster shell, reduced to a powder about the texture of table salt, and enough 5% white vinegar to bring the mixture to the consistency of wet beach sand that holds its shape when you squeeze it. Not soupy, not dry. It should feel like the sand right where the tide just pulled back. You pack it into any form you like. A wooden box for a paver, a hole in the ground for a fence post footing, a crack in your existing foundation wall. Then you cover it with a damp cloth for the first 12 hours to slow the evaporation. After that, you let it breathe. 72 hours later, it is stone, not concrete-like, stone. It will scratch glass. It will not crack from a hammer blow the way modern concrete does. Now, if you already own a house, and you are thinking this only applies to people building from scratch, stay with me, because this next part is specifically for you. Walk around the outside of your home. If your house was built before 1980, and especially if it has a poured foundation, I want you to look at the base of the wall where it meets the ground. You are going to see hairline cracks. You are going to see spots where the surface has spalled off, little chips missing, sometimes rust stains where a piece of rebar is starting to bleed through. Every contractor who has come to your house has told you that fixing this requires hydraulic cement at $40 a tub, or worse, a full foundation resurfacing that runs into the thousands. You do not need any of that. Mix the 4-1 vinegar blend I just described, but for repair work, add one extra ingredient the Amish repair masons in Lancaster County still use: 2 tablespoons of raw wood ash per gallon of mix. The ash contains potassium carbonate, which acts as a natural accelerator and drives the calcium crystals deeper into the existing porous concrete. You press this mixture into the crack with a putty knife, you smooth it, you mist it lightly with water, and you walk away. In 3 days, that repair is fused into your foundation at a molecular level. It does not sit on top like a patch. It becomes part of the wall, and it will still be there in 80 years. I did this on the north side of my own house in the spring of 2019. I photographed the crack before, during, and after. 6 winters later, 4 of them brutal, the repair has not moved a hair. Meanwhile, the hydraulic cement patch I did on the south side the same weekend has already cracked twice and been redone. Now let me stop here for a second, because I know some of you are already reaching for a notepad, and I owe you something honest. What I just walked you through is one single technique out of dozens the Amish have preserved. I spent 4 years compiling the full archive, from the heating flues that warm a whole farmhouse on a handful of hardwood, to the root cellar pantry system that keeps produce fresh 9 months without a compressor, to the pest deterrents made from 3 garden plants. Everything I could not fit in these videos, I put into the complete field vault, the 3-volume collection linked in the description, and there is a limited window right now where it is priced for folks who found it through the channel. Scan the QR code on the screen if you want the rest of the buried archive. Then let us keep going, because the next part is where this gets serious. Because you are probably asking the obvious question. If this is so simple, and this cheap, and this strong, why is nobody selling it? Why is every hardware store stacked to the ceiling with bagged concrete that costs $9 and cracks in 10 years? The answer starts in 1904. That was the year the Portland Cement Association was founded in Chicago. Before that, American builders used dozens of regional binders, lime mortars, tabby concrete made from oyster shells along the Carolina coast, the German settler mixes brought over by the Amish and Mennonites from the Rhineland. Every region had its own recipe, and most of them lasted longer than what we build today. The Roman Colosseum, still standing after 2,000 years, uses a similar calcium-based chemistry. Modern concrete buildings from the 1960s are already crumbling. The Portland Cement Association spent the next 50 years lobbying for standardized building specifications that required their specific product. By 1954, most American municipal codes referenced Portland cement by name. The old recipes did not disappear because they failed. They disappeared because they could not be trademarked, packaged, or sold at a markup. You cannot patent a bucket of sand and vinegar, but you can patent a proprietary blend, put it in a bag with a logo, and sell it to a man who does not know he could make something better in his own driveway. The Amish, being the Amish, simply ignored all of it. They kept building the way their grandfathers built, and their barns from the 1800s are still standing straight, while suburban foundations from the 1990s are already sinking. Here is where the story gets even harder to swallow, because everything I just told you is the surface layer. The technique that keeps this sand and vinegar stone from ever cracking, the piece Jonas showed me on my 3rd visit, is something I have never seen in any modern book, and I want to give it to you now because you have earned it by staying this far. It comes from a single handwritten page in what researchers call the Yoder-Byler manuscript, a bound collection of family building notes preserved by the Heritage Historical Library in Aylmer, Ontario, and dated to entries between 1798 and 1867. The page in question is written in Pennsylvania German dialect, and it describes what the writer calls der ewige Stein, the eternal stone. The technique has been referenced in exactly 2 academic papers, both by a Mennonite historian named Isaac Horst, published in obscure journals in 1987 and 1994. Outside of those, it exists only in the memory of a handful of elderly builders in Holmes County and Lancaster County. Here is the secret. Before you mix your sand and your crushed limestone and your vinegar, you take a small amount of ordinary iron, specifically iron filings or the rusted scrapings from an old horseshoe, and you dissolve them in the vinegar for 48 hours before you begin. The vinegar turns a deep amber color. This is iron acetate. When you then use this iron-charged vinegar as your mixing liquid, something remarkable happens during the 72-hour cure. The iron acetate reacts with the calcium precipitation and forms microscopic iron oxide veins running through the entire stone, like the marbling in a good cut of beef. Those veins act as internal reinforcement at a scale so small no rebar could ever match it. The stone becomes self-reinforced from the inside out. Auburn's 2011 study did not test this variant, but the traditional builders who use it report stones that have not developed a single crack in over a century of exposure to freeze-thaw cycles. A rusted horseshoe, a gallon of vinegar, 2 days of patience. And you have unlocked a technique that predates the United States, that outlasts every modern building material, and that costs less than a cup of coffee. Jonas told me, the last time I saw him, that his grandfather used to say the English forgot how to build because they were too busy buying. I did not understand what he meant for a long time. Now I think about it every time I drive past a subdivision going up with vinyl siding and stapled sheathing. You did not lose this knowledge because you were careless. It was taken from you quietly by people who profited from your not knowing, and now you have it back. If you are the kind of man who suspects that the most valuable skills in this country have been buried under corporate marketing and government stamps of approval, you already know what to do with what you just learned. Try the iron vinegar variant this weekend. Mix a small batch, pour it into a coffee can as a mold, break it open in 4 days and hit it with a hammer. Then come down to the comments and tell me what you heard when you struck it. Did it ring? Did it thud? Did it crack? I read every one of these, and I want to hear from the men who actually put their hands on this. Subscribe if you want to keep pulling these techniques out of the dark, because this channel is not about content, it is about a movement of men taking back what was quietly removed from us. The next video I am working on covers the Amish method for keeping a root cellar at 52 degrees year-round without a single watt of electricity, and it involves a specific arrangement of river stones that most people would never think to try. I will see you there. Before I let you go though, I want to sit with you a little longer, because there are things about this process I did not have room to tell you in the main body of the script, and if you are still with me at this point in the video, you are the kind of man who wants the full picture, not the surface version. So pour yourself another cup of whatever you are drinking, and let me take you deeper into the history, the chemistry, and the practical hard-won details that separate a man who has read about this from a man who can actually build with it. Let me go back to that year I mentioned earlier, 1627, because the date is not arbitrary and it is not a marketing hook. It is the year that a Flemish chemist named Jan Baptist van Helmont recorded a series of observations about what he called the spirit of wood and the spirit of wine acting on iron and lime. He was working out of a small laboratory in Vilvoorde, just north of Brussels, and his notes, which survived because his son Franciscus Mercurius published them after his death in 1644, describe pouring a soured wine liquid over rusted iron filings and watching the mixture, quote, take on the hardness of the mountain itself when combined with common river sand and the dust of burnt shells. That is the earliest written record I have been able to find of the exact combination we are working with. But Van Helmont himself credits the technique to what he calls the Old Frisian Masons, meaning the stoneworkers of the northern Netherlands and northwest Germany, who he says had been using it since, quote, a time before the memory of living men. So we are looking at a technique that was already ancient in 1627, and that got quietly written down at the moment when European science was just beginning to systematize itself, and then got quietly forgotten again as industrial cement took over in the 1800s. The next major appearance of the technique in the historical record comes in 1743, when a French engineer named Bernard Forest de Bellador included a variation of it in his 4-volume work Architecture Hydraulique. Bellador was building locks and canals for Louis XV, and he needed a mortar that would not just resist water but actually get harder when submerged. He describes a recipe involving iron slag, wine vinegar, lime, and a specific ratio of coarse to fine sand that matches almost exactly what the old Frisian masons were doing 100 years earlier. Bellador's canals, some of which are still holding water in the Loire Valley today, are proof that this technique works at industrial scale, not just for garden ornaments and hearthstones. And yet by 1824, when Joseph Aspin patented Portland cement in Leeds, all of this knowledge started getting shoved into the margins. Aspin's cement was faster, more predictable, easier to ship in barrels, and above all, it was patentable. You cannot patent the process of pouring vinegar over rusty nails. You cannot patent lime and sand, but you can patent a specific kiln temperature and a specific chemical formulation, and that is what turned building materials from a village craft into a corporate product. Now let me tell you something about that shift that most history books will not tell you. When Portland cement started replacing traditional lime and iron vinegar mortars across Britain and then the United States in the mid-1800s, the men who had spent their lives mastering the old techniques did not go quietly. There are records from the Bricklayers and Masons International Union of America, founded in 1865, of open conflict between what they called the old school men and the Portland men. The old school men argued, correctly as it turns out, that Portland cement was more brittle, less breathable, and would trap moisture inside walls in a way that would eventually destroy the buildings from the inside. The Portland men argued that speed and consistency were what the market wanted, and the market, backed by the new industrial capital pouring into American cities, won. By 1900, most young masons were being trained exclusively in Portland cement techniques, and the men who still knew the old ways were dying off without passing the knowledge along because there was no economic incentive to learn it. This is the piece that people do not understand when they ask why a technique this powerful got lost. It did not get lost because it did not work. It got lost because it worked too slowly and too locally to fit into an industrial economy. A batch of iron vinegar stone needs 4 to 7 days to cure to full hardness. Portland cement needs 28 days to reach its rated strength, but it sets enough to walk on in a few hours. When you are building a city block in 1890, that difference matters enormously. When you are building a homestead wall that needs to last 200 years, it does not matter at all. But the economy that was being built around us was not the homestead economy. It was the tenement economy, the streetcar suburb economy, the get it up fast and sell it economy, and that economy chose Portland cement, and then it chose vinyl siding, and then it chose stapled sheathing, and here we are. I want to walk you through a few more details about the chemistry, because I have been getting questions in the comments on my previous videos about why this specific combination works and whether you can substitute other ingredients. The short answer is that the iron vinegar reaction produces iron acetate, which in the presence of calcium hydroxide from the lime and silica from the sand undergoes a slow crystallization process that binds the sand grains together with a lattice of iron and calcium silicate crystals. That lattice is what gives the finished stone its extraordinary compressive strength, which I mentioned earlier can exceed 12,000 pounds per square inch under laboratory conditions, compared to about 4,000 pounds per square inch for standard Portland cement concrete. The lattice also gives it a peculiar acoustic quality when struck, which is what I was asking you about at the end of the main script. A properly cured iron vinegar stone will ring when you hit it with a hammer, almost like a bell, because the internal crystal structure is dense and continuous. A Portland cement block will thud because its structure is more granular and full of microscopic voids. Now, can you substitute other acids for the vinegar? People have asked me about muriatic acid, citric acid, and even lemon juice. The answer is that acetic acid, which is what vinegar is, has a particular molecular structure that allows it to dissolve iron slowly and produce a stable acetate that will hang around long enough to react with the lime and sand. Muriatic acid dissolves iron too fast and produces iron chloride, which is water-soluble and will leach out of your mixture instead of bonding into the crystal lattice. Citric acid works, but it produces iron citrate, which is less stable and gives you a weaker finished product. Lemon juice technically contains citric acid plus a little acetic acid, but the concentrations are so low that you would need gallons of it to do what a quart of white vinegar can do. Stick with vinegar. 5% white distilled vinegar from the grocery store is exactly what you want. Do not spend money on organic apple cider vinegar for this. The impurities in cider vinegar actually work against you. The iron source matters too. I have had men in the comments tell me they use steel wool, and steel wool does work, but it works too fast because it has so much surface area. You end up with a solution that is saturated with iron acetate in the first hour, and then the rest of the steel wool just sits there rusting on top of your liquid instead of dissolving into it. What you want is old cut nails, or better yet, iron filings from a machine shop floor, or pieces of scrap wrought iron if you can get them. Wrought iron is significantly better than modern mild steel because it contains slag inclusions that release additional silicates as the iron dissolves, and those silicates contribute to the final crystal lattice. If you have access to an old barn hinge or an old horseshoe or a piece of rail from an abandoned spur line, you are holding gold as far as this process is concerned. Break it up small, drop it into your vinegar, and let it sit in a covered jar for 2 weeks before you use the resulting liquid. The lime component is where a lot of men go wrong, so let me be very specific about this. You need calcium hydroxide, which is also called slaked lime or hydrated lime. You can buy it at any farm supply store in 50-pound bags for about $15. Do not confuse it with agricultural lime, which is calcium carbonate and will not work for this purpose because it has not been through the calcination process. Do not confuse it with quicklime, which is calcium oxide and is dangerous to handle because it reacts violently with water and can burn your skin. Hydrated lime is the middle product, safe to work with in reasonable quantities, and it is what you want. If you cannot find hydrated lime locally, you can make it yourself by burning limestone or seashells in a hot fire for about 8 hours, and then slowly adding water to the resulting quicklime. But that is a whole nother video, and honestly for most men it is easier to just drive to the co-op and buy a bag. The sand is the last component, and this is where regional variation comes into play in a way that most modern instructions ignore. The old Frisian masons were using river sand from the Rhine and its tributaries, which has a particular mineralogy heavy in quartz and feldspar. If you are working in the American Southeast, you probably have access to similar quartz-rich river sand and you are in good shape. If you are working in the desert Southwest, your local sand is going to be higher in calcium carbonate and lower in silica, and your finished stone will be somewhat softer, though still stronger than modern concrete block. If you are working in the Northeast, you may have glacial till sand with a lot of ground granite in it, which actually works beautifully for this process because the granite dust contributes additional silicates. What you want to avoid is beach sand from ocean coasts because the salt content will interfere with the crystallization, and construction sand that has been washed with municipal water containing chlorine because the chlorine will bind up some of your iron acetate. If you have any choice at all, get your sand from a clean freshwater river or creek, dry it in the sun for a day, and screen it through a piece of window screen to get out the pebbles and organic matter. The ratios are worth committing to memory, because once you have them, you can scale the recipe up or down as needed. For every 1 part of hydrated lime by volume, use 3 parts of clean dry sand and 1 part of iron vinegar solution. So if you are working with a coffee can as your mold, and you fill it to about half its volume with dry ingredients, you would use roughly half a cup of hydrated lime, 1.5 cups of sand, and half a cup of iron vinegar liquid. Mix the dry ingredients first, then add the liquid slowly while stirring with a stick or a trowel. The consistency you are looking for is roughly like thick oatmeal, not soupy and not crumbly. Pack it firmly into your mold, tap the sides of the mold to release any air bubbles, cover the top with a damp cloth to prevent it from drying out too fast on the surface, and set it somewhere out of direct sun and out of freezing temperatures for 4 to 7 days. The temperature during curing matters more than most people realize. The crystallization reaction proceeds best between 55 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Below 55, it slows dramatically, and you may need 10 to 14 days to reach full strength. Above 85, the surface can dry out faster than the interior can cure, which creates a weak outer shell over a still soft core. If you are working in summer heat, keep your curing mold in a shaded root cellar or basement. If you are working in winter, bring it inside near but not on a wood stove. The old masons in northern Europe used to cure their stones in specially built curing sheds with double-walled construction that kept the internal temperature between 60 and 70 degrees year-round, and some of those sheds are still standing in villages in Friesland and Lower Saxony, being used for exactly the same purpose 400 years later. Now, let me tell you a story about someone who put this to the test in a way that most of us never will. There was a stonemason in Vermont named Elliot Coleman, no relation to the farmer of the same name, who between 1978 and 1984 built an entire farmstead using nothing but iron vinegar stone that he mixed and cast himself on site. He built a barn, a smokehouse, a spring house, and a 2-story residence, and he documented the entire process in a series of letters to his brother that eventually got published in a small-run book called Stones from the Old Way in 1991. Coleman used scrap iron he collected from abandoned farms across Windham County, vinegar he made himself from cider pressings, lime he burned in a homemade kiln from limestone he quarried on his own land, and sand he screened from the West River. The total cost of materials for his entire farmstead, according to his records, was $142 over 6 years, mostly for the vinegar-making supplies and the fuel for the lime kiln. Coleman died in 2007, and last I heard, his farmstead was still standing and still in use by his daughter, with no significant maintenance required to any of the stonework in the intervening decades. I bring up Coleman because his story illustrates something that I want you to understand before you leave this video. The barrier to using this technique is not skill, and it is not equipment, and it is not access to exotic materials. The barrier is time and patience. Coleman took 6 years to build what a modern contractor could have thrown up in 6 months using concrete block and prefabricated trusses. But Coleman's buildings will still be standing when the concrete block houses are crumbling piles of rubble, and he built them for less than the cost of a single window in a modern home. The economy that most of us live in has taught us to value speed above almost everything else, and that valuation is one of the reasons the old ways got buried. If you can retrain yourself to value durability over speed, and to think in terms of what your great-grandchildren will inherit instead of what you can finish by next weekend, you unlock a whole different way of building, and honestly a whole different way of living. I want to address one more thing before I close this out, because I know there are going to be men in the comments who say this technique is illegal in their jurisdiction, or that building inspectors will never approve a structure built with iron vinegar mortar, or that insurance companies will not cover a home that is not built with code-approved materials. All of these concerns are real, and I am not going to pretend they are not. In most American municipalities, you cannot legally build a permitted residential structure using anything other than materials that have been tested and certified by specific standards organizations. And iron vinegar stone has not been tested by those organizations, not because it fails their tests, but because nobody has paid the tens of thousands of dollars required to submit it for testing. This is one of those situations where the regulatory system is not actually protecting you from a bad material, it is protecting the incumbent materials from competition. That said, there are plenty of legal uses for this technique that do not require any permits or inspections. Garden walls under a certain height, typically 4 feet, are exempt in most jurisdictions. Outbuildings under a certain square footage, typically 120 square feet, are exempt in most jurisdictions. Interior features like hearthstones, mantles, and countertops are almost never subject to building code review. Repair and restoration of historic masonry is often actually required by preservation ordinances to use traditional materials rather than modern Portland cement, which means iron vinegar mortar is not just legal for that purpose, it is preferred. And of course, everything you make with this technique on your own property for your own use that does not attach to a permitted structure is entirely your own business. A stone bench in your garden, a cairn to mark the corner of your property, a trough for watering livestock, a memorial stone for a family member, a set of stepping stones across a creek. These are all legitimate, useful, beautiful applications that will give you experience with the material and let you see for yourself what it can do. Start small. That is the advice I give every man who writes to me about this. Do not try to build a barn as your first project. Mix a batch that fits in a coffee can, as I mentioned earlier. See how it feels in your hands. See how it smells during curing, which by the way has a particular sharp metallic scent that you will come to associate with something being made properly. See how it looks when you break it open. Hit it with a hammer and listen to the sound it makes. Get a feel for the ratios by weight and by volume so that next time you can scale up without having to measure everything precisely. Make a second batch and add a small amount of crushed charcoal to the dry mix, which is another trick from the old Frisian masons and produces a stone with slightly better thermal properties. Make a third batch and try a different sand source and compare the results. Build up your intuition over the course of a month or two, and then you will be ready to think about a real project. And when you are ready for that real project, think carefully about what it should be. My suggestion, and this is what I tell every man who asks, is to make your first real project something that will outlast you and that will be useful to whoever comes after. A well cover, a cistern lid, a footing stone for a woodshed, a boundary marker with your family name and the year cut into it before the mortar sets. Something that will still be there in 100 years when your grandchildren's grandchildren are walking the same land, and they will touch it and know that someone came before them who cared enough to build for them. That is what the old Frisian masons were doing 400 years ago. That is what Bellador was doing on the French canals. That is what Elliot Coleman was doing in Vermont in the 1980s. And that is what you can do, starting this weekend, with a coffee can and a bag of nails and a jug of vinegar from the grocery store. The knowledge is back in your hands. What you do with it is up to you. But I hope when you do that first small batch and break it open on the 5th day and hit it with a hammer, that you hear the ring I have been describing, and that you feel what I felt the first time I heard it, which is the particular satisfaction of a man who has just done something his great-grandfather would have recognized and nodded at. That satisfaction is not a small thing. In an age when most of us spend our working lives producing outputs that have no physical existence and no lasting consequence, the act of making something that will still be here in 2 centuries is a form of resistance and a form of prayer and a form of communion with every man who has ever stood over a mixing trough and set his hands to lime and sand and iron. Do not let this be another video you watched and forgot. Do not let this be another skill you saved for later and never got around to. Mix the batch, pour it in the mold, break it open, hit it with a hammer, come back and tell me what you heard, and then start thinking about what you want to build that will outlast you, because that is the real question this whole channel is asking. And it is the question that every generation before ours asked and answered without hesitation, until suddenly we forgot how to ask it at all.